Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We have a great episode for you this week with Dan Shapiro back with us to discuss the Gaza ceasefire deal, U.S.-Israel ties in the age of Bibi-sitting, my term, not necessarily Dan's term, and what next on the Iran front, and much, much more. Dan was, of course, U.S. Ambassador to Israel for most of the Obama administration, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the recent Biden administration, and in general has held a slew of senior policy positions at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Congress over the past 3 decades. Dan is currently a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council in the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Some of our listeners and viewers, remember, we're now a video podcast available on YouTube, but you all may recall that Dan was on this past June, literally on the eve of the outbreak of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Like everything else during the next 2 weeks, that episode, which was terrific, trust me, kind of got lost in the shuffle. But it's still super relevant in terms of Biden administration policy throughout the Gaza war after October 7th, prospects for regional integration, which Dan was intimately involved in, Barack Obama's eulogy for Shimon Peres way back when. There was a lot in that episode from June 12th, so do check it out. After you finish this episode, of course. One other programming note, I'll be traveling over the next few weeks, so podcast production may be a bit different while I'm away. Even journalists deserve time off, especially journalists. No, I wouldn't go that far, but even journalists need some time away. So just FYI on that. And also, just by way of context, we recorded this episode around midday Tel Aviv time on Wednesday. Despite the ceasefire, we just had another escalation in Gaza yesterday on Tuesday, when one IDF reservist was tragically killed by Hamas fire in the southern Gaza Strip. And this came after Hamas staged the recovery of a deceased hostage body, which later turned out to be the remains of Ofir Tzarfati. Ofir Tzarfati was abducted from the Nova Music Festival during the October 7th attack. He was killed in captivity by Hamas, and his body was officially recovered by the IDF way back in November 2023 and brought back home to Israel for burial. It's a terrible story that we don't need to get into now, but Israel responded with fairly wide-scale airstrikes overnight, but as of now, and with Donald Trump's prodding, the ceasefire is back on, and more hostages will hopefully be released soon. But can the deal hold? For an answer to that question, amongst many other questions, let's get to Dan Shapiro. Hi, Dan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Neri. Good to be back. Good to be with you again.
It's great to have you back, Dan, especially after last time you were on right before the 12-day war back in June. So this should be, if all goes according to plan, what we call here in Israel chavaya metakenet, a corrective experience to the last episode you were on, which, by the way, was terrific. And I will urge all our listeners and viewers to go back and check that out. But you also, I thought, would be the exact right guest for this week as well, to discuss all things Gaza, U.S.-Israel relations, Iran, and more. So thank you again for agreeing to come on. Hopefully this time there will not be a full-blown war in the Middle East. Fingers crossed, especially since I'm getting on another flight tomorrow. That's a different story. So Dan, the first and most obvious question to you and probably to most of our listeners, what did you make of the Gaza ceasefire deal brokered by Donald Trump and his team? Came into effect on October 10th. Especially as someone like yourself who was intimately involved in the diplomacy during the Biden administration, looking to halt, if not end, the Gaza war yourselves.
Thanks again, Neri, for having me. Look, this ceasefire and hostage deal that President Trump was able to announce and then see executed during his visit was a very significant accomplishment, obviously. The return of the 20 living hostages was essential and a major event for all of Israeli society and something that needed to happen. And so an unalloyed good that was achieved. The other elements of the deal, the end of the fighting, the pullback of Israeli forces to what's called now the Yellow Line, the 53% of Gaza, the inflow of significantly increased amount of humanitarian assistance, the return of Palestinian prisoners, some of them, of course, very bloody-handed terrorists.
Right.
These were all the other elements of that deal that sort of had to happen. Now, in his typical style, President Trump, oversold it. It's not Middle East peace. It's not going to be everlasting. It's not, the end of a 3,000-year conflict. But it's really important, and all credit due to him and his team, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. I think actually Kushner's involvement was really critical because his relationships and experience in this field, I think, are sort of some things that Witkoff was in some ways struggling with, but Kushner sort of helped land. In terms of the elements of it, Middle East wars tend to end messy. There's not often a clear victory or surrender. Everybody has to sort of accept terms that are less than their optimal terms or their maximal terms they had set. And often the terms are set by the United States and they're less than Israel wants, but sort of meet Israel's basic needs. In this case, I think there was an exhaustion that had set in. I mean, a lot of people have asked me, well, why didn't it happen during the Biden administration? And, there are a whole range of reasons for that. One is simply time, exhaustion. Hamas, of course, was under, renewed military pressure because of the Israeli operation in Gaza City that was advancing, although slowly, because the IDF was very concerned about losing hostages, losing soldiers, etc. But there was real pressure there. Hamas further pressured by how much Iran and the other members of the Axis of Resistance had been weakened over the course of the war, and at some point was looking to survive, which is really Hamas's main goal in these types of wars, to be able to crawl out from the rubble when it's over. Israel, though, was also exhausted. We know how I was in Israel for much of September before Rosh Hashanah, and at that time, the impatience and the bitterness even of many Israelis about that it was taking so long to get hostages out was really, really profound. We know how stressed the reserve force was. We know that Israel was facing kind of a wave of international isolation, of course, the recognition of Palestinian state by numerous countries, and even, as we've seen, blows to Israel's support in the United States and in both parties to some degree. So there are those factors, and Trump then, of course, had leverage for his goals and used it. I must say, I think he had that leverage all along. He came into office with a ceasefire in place, and I think he could have acted as he did only after the strike in Doha, which I'll get to in a second. Much earlier in the year, and I wrote about it, several times, and he even took decisions that kind of set back the eventual achievement of this ceasefire and hostage deal with his Gaza Riviera plan and not objecting to the Gaza City project, et cetera. But what did clearly flip the script was the Doha strike by Israel against Hamas leaders. Wasn't very successful, of course, and it really raised the alarm, both for the Qataris, but others in the Gulf as well, and for Trump, who had said he wanted to end the war, he wanted to get the hostages out. Again, I think he made some decisions earlier in the year that were not in concert with those goals. But once that risk of the war coming to the Gulf, presented itself, it really, I think, caused him to change his approach, and then he really began to exercise very quickly the leverage he always had on Netanyahu. But very importantly, it wasn't just U.S. pressure on Israel to agree to terms it had not agreed to, which it did. It agreed ultimately to end the fighting without the full disarmament and removal from power of Hamas from all of Gaza. But he also
no total victory like had been promised.
Correct. So he had to accept terms that he had said he would not. But he also, very importantly, then got Qatar and Turkey, particularly. I think Turkey was a really critical element here, not one sufficiently exercised during the Biden administration because of their connection with Hamas. He got those two countries to use their leverage on Hamas to pressure them to agree to terms that they had not agreed to previously, which was the return of all the hostages. They haven't fully fulfilled yet on the among deceased hostages, but to agree to those terms without Israel's full departure from Gaza, or even a guarantee that the end of the war was permanent. Although I think Trump strongly implied that that would be the case. And he did that with some of the transactional kind of deals that he does, which seemed to be effective in this case. Turkey got at least a soft approval of the F-35 aircraft that they've been seeking. Qatar got a security guarantee and an executive order. So he used all of those tools and got both sides then to agree to less than their total victory demands. Now, again, back to the question of why Trump did it, Biden didn't do it, why now, not earlier. Mm-hmm. There are clearly some unique political factors here. Netanyahu, because of the way he has tied himself and his political identity to Trump, really does not have the ability, or not without very high political costs, to say no. If Trump says, I need you to do this, I'm insisting you do this, he doesn't really have the ability to say no. We know that Netanyahu's history, and this was true in the Obama administration, actually it's true all the way back in the Clinton administration, and it was true in periods of the Biden administration, found that he could sort of gain political benefits in some ways by resisting the demands of Democratic presidents. Didn't work that way for him with Trump. And then in the U.S. side, Trump faced no domestic political pushback at all for kind of leaning in with the pressure that he did, and the leverage he did exert. It's hard to imagine, that there wouldn't have been some very strong reaction had President Biden, called publicly for ceasefires the way Trump has now twice, once in Iran and once with Gaza. If he had engaged in direct talks with Hamas, as at one point Kushner and Witkoff did, if he had publicly said, a red line for annexation of the West Bank. These are all things Trump has done. Not a whisper of criticism from his own party. The Republican Party basically doesn't criticize him on anything, and Democrats want the war to end. And so we're kind of encouraging of using these tools. Now, that's not to say that everything. I'm not in the camp that says everything that was done during the Biden administration was perfect. It was not. There were mistakes made. Things could have been done differently, better. In the end, that ceasefire that Trump inherited and worked on together during the transition with Biden, I think is meaningful and helped lead to this point. But clearly, we wanted to achieve more than we did. So this is not a defense of that. It's just saying that it's not apples to apples comparison about the political circumstances in either country that Biden faced. The last thing I'll just say is that Trump then, when he made that decision after Doha to really push, he used, I think, a very unconventional and improvisational style of diplomacy, but from which there's a lot to learn in order to get everyone to yes. He met with a bunch of Arab leaders at the UN General Assembly, kind of laid out what then became known as the 20-point plan to them, and got their endorsement to it. And then he was going into a meeting the following Monday with Netanyahu at the White House, where he was going to announce it. But over the weekend, the Israelis came and said, well, there are things we don't like about it. So they rewrote a big chunk of it. And then what he announced with Netanyahu on that Monday was not exactly what he had presented to the Arab states. And they didn't, really squeal publicly, although it was clear that there were changes. But then when Hamas responded to what he announced with Netanyahu with a very obvious yes, but, where they agreed to parts and didn't agree to other parts, and Netanyahu clearly was uncomfortable with that because he wanted them, to accept everything. Trump just took the yes and ignored the but. And he dared everyone to say no to him once he was announcing things that even people hadn't fully agreed to yet. And clearly, making the decision that the most important thing was to get the ceasefire and the hostages home, and that the phase 2 elements, which we'll talk about, would have to, be dealt with after the fact. I think that was a very good and correct decision, and facilitated by this sort of very improvisational style of diplomacy. And again, I think there's lessons to be learned from that. So meaningful accomplishment for sure, very meaningful, and credit due to the president and his team. Clearly, we're seeing violations of the ceasefire to some degree. Hamas has shot at Israeli soldiers across the yellow line, most recently in Rafah. Hamas has not returned, but I think it's still 13 of the deceased hostages and is,
Yes.
playing kind of the cruel games it does to pretend it doesn't know where they are, or, maybe there are a few it doesn't, but probably most it does, and try to hold on to that leverage and the psychological warfare benefits. And so Israel has to respond to some of these violations, but I think the violations and the responses are sort of within the range of the usual testing of the limits of a ceasefire. And I do think there's a pretty high likelihood the fundamental ceasefire is going to hold for the foreseeable future, because Trump really doesn't want it to resume again. He wants to say, this was a big accomplishment, and the war flare back up again would be a blow to that. Hamas, I mentioned, was exhausted and under pressure from its supporters and Arab partners that it not resume major fighting. So I think it's a good opportunity to keep those benefits in place while trying, and we'll talk about it now, to get on to phase two. But phase two is much, much harder and much, much more complicated.
So that's a great laying out of, not only your opinion, but basically what just transpired in recent weeks and recent months. And we'll dive into various issues that you raised, Dan. I also was struck by Trump's method, by his, like you said, improvisational style. Some would say taking constructive ambiguity to its nth degree, like essentially ignoring what Hamas did or did not agree to. So the Trump people keep saying, well, Hamas agreed to disarm, and Hamas, it's not all clear to me whether Hamas agreed to disarm at all. And that will have to be
that was in the butt, right? They said yes to phase one, and they did not say yes to disarmament, which is phase two, and they didn't sign for that. That's not what was signed, and now we're still working on phase two.
Yeah, but he took the win. He took phase one. I'm curious, just in terms of the Biden administration and the history of the negotiations when you guys were in power versus the deal we got just a few weeks ago. I'm sure you're aware, there's obviously a debate, definitely here in Israel, maybe even in the United States, about, well, this deal was on the table a year ago under the Biden administration. Now, I'm curious to get your sense. You laid out the issues of why the deal didn't happen, but in terms of the actual details that we eventually got, do you think they are comparable to what could have been, or at least was on the table a year ago? Or was it strictly a case that a year ago, Israel was only willing to negotiate a partial deal and not a full deal like Trump essentially forced Netanyahu into?
I think, again, at that time, there were numerous occasions. I wasn't a direct participant in those negotiations, although I was obviously largely aware of what was happening. There were numerous occasions in which Hamas made clear it was not talking about or willing to discuss the release of all hostages, and intended to hold on to some, even in a hostage deal. And in all these negotiations, it would take to the very, very last stage before they would even put names on the table, before they would actually start to talk about who might be eligible to be released. And so that was not, I think, something Hamas was really prepared to do. In the end, the deal that was struck during that transition involved a two-phase element, which I think 30 hostages came out in that first phase, and then second phase never really happened. But that second phase still needed to be negotiated. But it was also true during most of that period that Netanyahu also didn't want to go to an permanent end of the war without achieving those more maximal goals, and at various times added conditions to ceasefires. I think most famously last summer, 24 was the Philadelphia corridor, which at the time Minister of Defense Gallant, who was our main counterpart when I was working in the Pentagon, was saying was not a security requirement. He considered it to be a political additional condition to those negotiations. So, they, really were not sufficiently exhausted, I guess you could say, either side, to, ultimately start to climb down from some of those conditions. By the time you get to the fall of 24, then the U.S. political calendar becomes a factor when, nobody's going to make a decision because before they see what the outcome of the election is, thinking that they might get, better terms or, a different team. Or
when you say no one, you mean the Israeli government?
I think the Israeli government, but I'm not sure it was any different for Hamas, to be honest. I mean, I don't know
Hmm.
that they had an opinion yet. I think at a certain point, once Trump was elected and took office, there's a certain fear factor because of, his style, somewhat blustery style. Sometimes he makes sort of threats that he doesn't really have an ability to back up, but they clearly didn't want to cross with him. They, maybe didn't fully assess his relationship and influence with the Qataris. But I think at a certain point, the negotiations just sort of, go into a freeze zone, which was really what was happening in September, October of 24, and then even after an election, it takes a while to figure out what's going on. Then it got serious in December, January during the transition.
Okay, I think that's a fair answer. And just finally on the issue of phase one and the flare up that we saw yesterday on Tuesday, also escalation over a week ago after 2 additional IDF soldiers were killed in southern Gaza, and Israel launched airstrikes back then as well across the strip. You're fair to say, optimistic that this will still hold, that Trump and his team can apply enough pressure on both Israel and Hamas to keep it contained, to get back on track, to keep releasing the hostages.
I'm fairly optimistic that the core of the ceasefire can hold, and that neither side, really wants to get back into sort of full scale fighting. There may be these skirmishes and exchanges. I'm, I'd say less optimistic that Hamas is going to fulfill its obligation on the remaining 13 deceased hostages. I think it will do ones and twos and delay and claim they don't, know the whereabouts or can't reach all these kinds of things. And I certainly worry that, in the final, well, there's not really going to be a final, but that it'll be hard to get to zero, right? There will always be 2 or 3 or 4 that, either there'll be some, dispute about their whereabouts, or they'll be genuinely unknown, or they will, have an incentive to keep that wound open. And of course, that includes, every one of these cases is tragic, of course, but it includes 2 American hostages, Omer Nutra and Itai Khan. And it includes Hadar Golden, whose
Right.
remains were taken in 2014 during Tzuk Eitan. So there's a lot of pain, psychological pain, that Hamas can generate and sees that it maybe benefits from in a sick way by dragging this out and holding on to what it can hold on to.
Yeah, and then it becomes a question: how does Israel respond if the number doesn't go to zero? How the Trump administration responds? What's the fate of the deal in stage 2?
Right,
if it's not
and
zero?
Trump just said a few days ago, 48 hours, Hamas had to release all of them. Well, they didn't. I don't know what the so what of that is. He does not want Israel to go back into full scale fighting. I don't think most Israelis want to go back to full scale fighting for the remains of 13 hostages, as much as they need to come home, and those are the terms of the deal. But that's a challenge, and Hamas is adept at playing those games when it has that kind of leverage.
It most certainly is, not just over the past 2 years, but in years well past that.
For sure.
And the issue of Hadar Golden too, the soldier who fell during the 2014 Israel-Hamas war. It belies any realistic kind of understanding that Hamas, who had been holding his remains for over a decade, doesn't know where they are.
Not plausible.
Out of any, yeah, it's not plausible. Out of anybody, he should have been the first to be returned. And the fact that Hamas didn't, like you said, it's probably playing games, because they certainly knew where his remains were for over a decade.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dan, in terms of the first phase, we've also seen what can only be called a major diplomatic push by the Trump administration, first to begin implementation of the deal and then to continue implementation of the deal. But last week, I think, reached a new peak where we saw this kind of, it's not even shuttle diplomacy. It's called, here in Israel, they called it like a air trade from DC to Ben Gurion Airport. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were here. Vice President J.D. Vance was here, and then Secretary of State Marco Rubio just left this past weekend. So as a veteran of these visits and these diplomatic efforts, give us some perspective. Is it really that unprecedented? Is it really, as it's come to be known, Bibi-sitting to make sure Netanyahu adheres to the ceasefire and fulfills his end? Or had this kind of thing happened before?
There's some precedent. I'll sort of say what I think maybe the closest precedent I'm aware of is from my time. But look, first thing to say is it demonstrates a serious and high-level commitment to seeing this ceasefire hold and to trying to get phase two underway. And again, we'll get into more details about that. And importantly, they have set up this civil military coordination center with a group of 200 or so U.S. service members from CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, led by the chairman, the commander of Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, I know very well, who I'm not sure he's on the ground constantly, but has been on the ground a significant amount of time to help manage a lot of the phase one implementation aspects and the preparation for what they hope will be phase two. So there's a kind of an operational piece of it. But on the political side, obviously the president coming in with a very successful visit, warm visit, speech in the Knesset, the day of the 20 living hostages returning home, followed by all those other visits you mentioned, is clearly a sign that this has high level attention and that's important, right? I mean, I think one of the concerns I have, is that over time, President Trump's attention will move elsewhere. And, he's the president of the United States. He has a lot on his plate. And demonstrating that, the political level of this administration, and since so much is handled top down in this administration, that's really important, is focused and committed, is a way of getting all sides to stay focused and committed to keeping it going. Now, they can't sustain that, right? You can't have the vice president and the secretary of state there every day, every week. So we'll see how that continues over the time. But certainly in those early days and first couple of weeks, to try to make sure that violations and skirmishes, which are happening on the margins of the ceasefire, don't escalate into some more full-blown conflict. That's an important way of doing that. And the term Bibi-sitting isn't one I'm using, but there's clearly an element of that, right? There's clearly an element of concern that, based on the fact that Hamas is in some violation, based on the fact that this was a hard deal to swallow, based on the fact that there are still elements of Netanyahu's coalition and government who oppose the original deal and want to respond more strongly to the fighting, that making sure that political level touch is keeping him focused on staying in the deal and moving forward. Probably there's an element to that. I think it was 2012, which was sort of, still in my first year as ambassador. I got there in the summer of 2011. So, but probably late spring, early summer of 2012 was a period when, we had some significant concerns that Israel was actively considering a military strike in Iran. That was known. It became more known later, but it was something we were obviously able to assess somewhat from things they told us, somewhat from, things that leaked out or other information. And there was a period when it wasn't back to back kind of relay race style, but every week to 2 weeks for a good 2 to 3 months, we had cabinet level visits, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, senior special envoys, National Security Advisor, coming to Israel to continue that conversation specifically, because we were still in a very sensitive phase where we and Israel had agreed much earlier in Obama's first term that we were going to try sanctions and holding out the prospect of diplomacy to get Iran to come to the table on negotiating significant limits on its nuclear program. The sanctions were having an effect. Even some military options were being put in place in case they didn't work. But the diplomacy had not yet begun. The Iranians had not yet come to the table. and the Israelis were worried that they were going to lose their window when their military option would still be viable. And so, there was a real risk that they would take that action. So, it didn't escape our, kind of analysis that if you have every week or two a, cabinet level U.S. official, the preparation for the visit itself, the immediate aftermath of the visit, that's probably buys you a week or two when it's not a very likely window that that decision on a military strike that we wanted them to wait on wouldn't be taken because they wouldn't want us to be as implicated in it, and that we might be able to persuade them. So there was some kind of precedent for that, but again, you can't sustain that for months. At some point, you have to get
Right.
some more durable and more stable set of understandings in place. But I think that's a legitimate tool for the United States to use in any relationship, and particularly in the unique closeness of the U.S.-Israel relationship.
For sure, and I don't think people should forget that in the early months of this current war, or the October 7th war, after the Hamas attack, it wasn't like you didn't see Biden administration officials at the highest levels coming to Israel. I don't want to say on a daily basis, but almost every week there was someone here, even sometimes sitting in on cabinet meetings and deliberations. So
that's right, and that in that point it was more about supporting Israel in the crisis, but obviously there were also tough decisions being made on whether to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon, on how to deal with the humanitarian aid needs of Gaza, and so there was both support and the ability to express U.S. views that mean leverage or pressure if we felt we needed to. So that's something we've seen before.
Right. Something that we may not have seen before, Dan, and it's something I've actually thought a lot about over the past 2 or 3 weeks. Like you said, the Civil Military Coordination Center sitting in Kiryat Gat in southern Israel, 200 U.S. service members there coordinating not only with the IDF, but also many other partner nations, the UK, Canada, Jordan, Egypt probably, and many others, sitting there essentially trying to figure out how to manage Gaza in the post-war environment, and also obviously set up this kind of new multinational peacekeeping force. This is really the internationalization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is it not? I mean, if you had told me, I want to say 3 years ago, that you'd have U.S. service members, sitting in Israel trying to figure out how to get a multinational peacekeeping force into Gaza, I don't know. I'm not sure Israel would have been too thrilled about that scenario, and I don't know if I'd have believed you. So I think that is in and of itself unprecedented, is it not?
That is unprecedented, and it's not clear, how successful it will be, right? Because still there are all kinds of hurdles to clear to get that phase 2 portion of the 20-point plan implemented. But this is a major investment by really, some of the most talented parts of the U.S. system, these military planners and civil military experts, and they've got numerous features, monitoring the ceasefire, which I think includes monitoring whether both sides are abiding by the terms of the ceasefire. Bit intrusive, actually, from the point of view of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but clearly something that Israel has decided they can live with. Helping with the delivery of humanitarian assistance to help map the routes and improve the flows, and support the creation, development, training, ultimate deployment of an international stabilization force. These are all things the United States military is very good at. I mean, there are going to be a lot of other things that are going to be needed if we get underway in phase 2, and I'm concerned that some of the Trump administration's earlier decisions on more or less disbanding USAID and a lot of our other experts in development and post-conflict transitions and things like that are going to cost us, because those are also skill sets and expertise that we don't have as much in good supply because of that. But this is a major,
really important point.
Right. This is already, even without that, a major investment, obviously a major footprint, hard to think of any precedent for that, or that it doesn't come without some discomfort from many Israelis that the U.S. is so present that it will really have, a veto or an ultimate say on certain decisions. But even with that said, many of the elements of phase two are still well ahead of us and very difficult. I don't know if you want to switch to talk about those, but we should.
Yeah, no, that was my next question. Especially, like I said, as someone who was dealing with post-war scenarios and trying to rally support, especially around the Middle East, amongst Arab governments for an active role in post-war Gaza. Now that post-war Gaza is apparently upon us, and discussions are ongoing, and yet, to the best of my understanding, nothing has been fully decided yet. How optimistic are you that these kind of heavy lift security, governance, and other issues related to phase two of the ceasefire deal will actually not only succeed, but actually get off the ground?
Right. I'm very concerned. I mean, this isn't a criticism. This is just an analysis that this is going to be very, very difficult. The key elements of phase two, of course, are the disarmament of Hamas and essentially its removal from power, the reconstruction of Gaza to be paid for largely by Gulf Arab states. There are various estimates from the World Bank and the UN and EU run in the range of $50 billion to $70 billion to do a kind of a full reconstruction of Gaza so that the population of Gaza can live. The creation of this international board, President Trump apparently chairing that board, maybe Tony Blair having some role, but also
the board of peace.
Board of peace. Also having, some kind of oversight of the international governing or the interim transitional governance of Gaza. And that's supported by an international stabilization force of probably Arab and Muslim states, and facilitating the entry of more moderate Palestinian governance, whether it's connected to the Palestinian Authority or not, as it goes through a reform process, a little bit gray, a little bit murky. But even, at the end of that 20-point plan, a diplomatic process between Israelis and Palestinians on a future and a political horizon, which acknowledges the Palestinian desire for a credible pathway for a Palestinian state, and that should be part of this discussion. That's all in the 20-point plan. Now, just to back up, you mentioned that I had previously done some work on the day after planning. In fact, I was still at the State Department on October 7th. I was working on the regional integration portfolio. Obviously, that unfortunately got very much shelved in the immediate aftermath of the attacks and the war starting. And I was asked to kind of lead an effort on day after planning. And I insisted that one of our core planning assumptions be that unless Hamas was actually defeated and actually removed from power and actually disarmed, we really wouldn't get to a day after. And that's because I felt that no Israeli leader, not Netanyahu and not anybody else, could, with legitimacy, say to the Israeli public after the horrific slaughter of October 7th, worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, that this Gaza war will end more or less as all the previous Gaza wars have ended, with Hamas battered and bruised, but clinging to power, still holding on to weapons, and ultimately trying to rebuild and prepare for another round. Unacceptable outcome. Mm-hmm. And it certainly was in the fall of 2023. And it, I think for most Israelis, it's still sort of an unacceptable outcome. The difference is 2 years have passed, the exhaustion, the cost, the unacceptably high cost it would have been to actually continue this war for several more months, in terms of more dead hostages, more dead soldiers, many more dead Palestinian civilians, further isolation of Israel, Israel getting stuck in a kind of a permanent occupation of all of Gaza. And so we're stuck still at the end of phase one with that exact scenario that I said wouldn't really allow us to get into a real day after. Hamas battered and bruised, clinging to power in now 47% of Gaza, but still potent enough.
Right. Consolidating its control in that 47%.
Absolutely.
Beyond the yellow line.
Yep. Right. And so whatever weapons it has to attack Israel, and it may still have, some small store of rockets, but it certainly has enough small arms to occasionally attack Israel across the and I think Kalashnikovs and RPGs and things like that to attack Israel across the line. But really, it's to consolidate control internally, and it's 47%, and to really carry out these just gruesome retribution killings of Palestinians who they think have opposed their rule. So that is disarming Hamas is really the key that unlocks the ability to get to all those other elements of phase two. If you can't get that done, I'm not sure anything else moves. I don't see Gulf states being willing to invest significant resources in reconstruction if Hamas is still in power, because they expect there will be another war and Israel will end up destroying what is rebuilt. I know from my later responsibilities in the Pentagon, talking to Arab governments and Muslim governments about their participation in an international stabilization force, that they are very unlikely to agree to come in if the requirement is to fight Hamas or disarm Hamas. They're not going into the tunnels. They're
Right.
not taking away the weapons. And I don't see a pathway for the Palestinian Authority or some other, more moderate Palestinian governing structure to kind of take hold if Hamas hasn't really been removed. And so you have a conflict kind of in suspended animation, but not a very easy pathway to get all those other elements of phase two going if Hamas manages to hold on to those weapons and can't be disarmed. So how do we disarm Hamas? That's the critical question, and nobody has a good answer to it. I don't have a great answer to it. There's probably only two parties who would actually fight Hamas sort of to the last weapon, which is Israel, if it needed to. And for all the reasons earlier stated, I think even Israelis don't want to get back into that fight. Or it's Palestinians. It's Palestinians. We've seen some of these clans or some of these other small groups that have done it on the margins, but probably don't have the strength to really challenge Hamas, for full control. The other alternative is the Palestinian Authority, but they're not ready. They're not sufficiently reformed. There's, of course, not a full Israeli agreement on that, but they would need training and time and preparedness to put a force in that could actually do that. So, all of those prospects are way, way in the future. How would you get Hamas to disarm, earlier? Look, I think the tool that President Trump exercised to get Hamas to agree to what it had not previously agreed to, which was releasing all those hostages, which was to motivate Qatar and Turkey, the two countries that have the most influence over Hamas. Qatar because they're the political support, the host of their leadership, some financial support. Turkey, in a way, again, I think was not sufficiently exploited as an asset here in the Biden administration because of the ideological connection. Erdogan is a fellow traveler. He believes in the Muslim Brotherhood cause, which is, the Hamas cause. And when he, sufficiently motivated because of his relationship with Trump or whatever he was getting, or just because he felt the moment had come, was able to tell Hamas, this is the moment. You have to get these hostages out. You have to get this war over. They made this terribly difficult decision to do things they had said they would not do. I think President Trump has to use the same tool and use the same leverage with those parties, and maybe more transactional deals with those parties to get them to put that kind of pressure on Hamas, and then construct a weapons, relinquishment structure, and even an exile plan for those Hamas fighters and leaders that remain in Gaza. This is something I also felt we should have worked on much earlier. There's some history to this. It's in the 20-point plan now, the idea of safe passage out of Gaza. But in 1982, U.S. diplomats arranged the exile and departure of about 14,000 PLO fighters from Beirut when the IDF had Beirut under siege. Went to camps all around the Middle East at some distance from Israel. This is not the same situation. Hamas is not the PLO. They're in what they consider their homeland. They might be jihadists willing to die in the tunnels, and yet properly pressured and properly incentivized by the parties they rely on for any political or economic or freedom of movement oxygen, which is Qatar and Turkey and to some degree Egypt. I don't rule out that you could get those remaining Hamas fighters and leaders to say, we're going to live to fight another day from some other place. That's a terrible way to think about it. and Israel will probably continue to pursue those people over time. But that is the sort of necessary key to unlock the pathway to getting the rest of phase two underway. So I think those are the tools that have to be exercised, and I'm concerned that absent that, and I think everybody's concerned about this, that we're gonna have this kind of stasis and a drift and a kind of a low grade conflict. The freezing in place of Israel in control of roughly half of Gaza, Hamas in control of the remaining half, no real reconstruction happening, no entry of international forces, and the seeds really being sown for the next round of the conflict, just as I feared, would be the case, and was and remains sort of an unacceptable outcome, but maybe where we are. The one caveat to this is that you hear talk about, well, maybe the reconstruction can start in the 53% that Israel holds. Some
New Gaza.
New Gaza, it's being called, right?
Yeah.
I'm dubious. I'm dubious that the Arab states will invest in reconstruction in an area that is essentially under Israeli occupation. I'm dubious that Palestinian civilians will move in any significant numbers into that space. The idea that that's where they could live more peacefully and start schools that would teach de-radicalization and get better flow of humanitarian systems or something. I just don't see significant numbers of Palestinians wanting to move inside Israeli lines. So it's an idea. It should be tested. The notion that you could prove to Gazans that the better life is available when not under Hamas rule, I suppose, is something that we hope is true, and Palestinians will want and then help achieve. But I think it's very hard to imagine either the investment or the movement of the population into that area, at least in the near term.
Right. And just on that point, how Israel would vet those people. I mean, is it just women and children? Is it, like we know from other places, boys under the age of 17 and older men over the age of 55? I mean, is that going to be the criteria? And how sustainable is that really? But very sobering, but I'd say very realistic overview you just gave, Dan. And also the focus on security and really Hamas's disarmament, I think, is critical and will likely be the main issue if and when for the first phase kind of comes to completion. I'm curious, just to bear down on this issue. So you're essentially arguing that Turkey, Qatar, and others need to apply political and maybe economic pressure on Hamas to agree to things that it perhaps doesn't necessarily want to agree to, like disarmament. But then that disarmament, okay, you're talking maybe about the heavier weapons, the tunnels that, essentially they'll be like, okay, get rid of these and then maybe we can move forward. Is that fair?
I think that's necessary. Obviously, the tunnels are essentially used for a military purpose, moving fighters around. Of course, that's where hostages were held, moving tunnels, moving weapons, even manufacturing weapons in those tunnels. It's not going to be easy for Hamas to kind of use them as they previously did, especially Israel controls still all the crossings, so it's harder to get materials into Gaza. But that's part of the military infrastructure of Gaza, and so I think it's Qatar and Turkish pressure on relinquishing the weapons and departing at least some critical mass of Hamas fighters and remaining leaders, and then then you could come up with a mechanism and an agreed party. Might be some Israelis, might be some Europeans, might be some Arabs, might be some others who could go in and sort of do the technical piece of destroying or otherwise decommissioning tunnels and things like that. But not in a phase when Hamas could be shooting at them and trying to fight them and prevent them from coming in. Okay,
that's a good clarification. I'm trying to kind of play this out in my own mind.
It's hard. This is really hard.
It is hard. Yeah.
No criticism. I mean, that's not criticism of President Trump and his team. I think what's laid out in the 20-point plan are the steps we want to see achieved. But the key that unlocks most of the rest of it is disarmament. And the kind of proposal I just put out is the best one I can come up with. It's not great, but I don't know of a better one.
Right. But this has been an issue vis-a-vis Gaza now for many years, even predating this war. How do you actually shift Hamas out, undermine its rule, bring in an alternative? It was always messy, even before the last 2 years of war and the utter destruction of physical Gaza too.
And look, let's be clear. A critical element of this is what the citizens or the residents of Gaza decide. It's hugely risky to take on Hamas. We've seen that in terribly bloody fashion, and just in the last couple of weeks, and long before that. But at some point, Palestinians saying we want to get this albatross off our necks. We want to get this organization that has ruined our lives out of our lives is also a really critical element. Now they could be supported and inspired and maybe encouraged to take on that kind of risk and that kind of role by some of these outside actors. But I do think that's also a critical element, also a very difficult one to generate with sufficient force.
Right. And just to tie this up, I think, if I hear you correctly, Dan, but I happen to agree with the sentiment, this can't just be a military or kinetic action. There has to be a kind of a political arm to it to push Hamas in the direction we all want them to go, and that we want Gaza to go into as well.
That's 100% true, and especially to get the Arab states to really play the parts they're supposed to play, reconstruction and international forces, but also even on the disarmament piece. The 20-point plan also contains elements that they needed, right? Guarantees that Israel's now talking about expelling the population from Gaza, or that anybody who leaves couldn't return, that Israel's not planning to annex Gaza. Separately, outside of the 20-point plan, President Trump has said, a red line is annexing the West Bank. Actually, it was the UAE that said that's a red line, but President Trump said it's not going to happen. He's not going to allow it to happen because he promised the Arab states it wouldn't. And they want to hear that there's some willingness to discuss a political horizon about, a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. At the moment, that's not high on any Israeli's agenda for perfectly understandable reasons. And it's going to be very hard to have that discussion as Israel goes into an election campaign when, the prime minister will probably be arguing to the Israeli public, which is all nearly across the board skeptical or hostile to the idea of a Palestinian state. I'm the leader that knows how to resist that pressure. And who do you trust to prevent that from coming into being? Donald Trump's best friend or some rookies and some newbies? And he'll make that argument. And even the opposition will probably say, yeah, we're not for that either. So if that's the discourse in an election year in Israel, that weighs heavily on getting the Arabs to feel that they're getting what they need to make the investments, different kinds of investments that we need them to make.
Right. Netanyahu has been putting out that message for 30 years. It's usually worked for him. So I don't see him changing in the coming months as we likely look at elections here in Israel. By the way, Dan, given all that with regard to a political horizon for the Palestinians, future Palestinian statehood and that issue, if all that is true, do you then see the prospects of further normalization, say, between Israel and Saudi, or Israel and other Arab or Muslim states, very low, despite the fact that the Gaza war has now seemingly ended?
I think it's not immediate, but I think those opportunities are still very present and should be seized and exploited as much as possible. First of all, there are several layers to why they're present. Among them is the dramatic weakening of Iran and its axis of proxy terror groups because of U.S. military power. Well, first because of Israeli military power and U.S. military power used over the last 2 years, and so that's a huge opportunity to help that alternative coalition of Israel, moderate Arab states, all U.S. partners, all members of Central Command, working with each other to defend each other. Frankly, that integration process in the defense sector was still happening all throughout the war. It's something I, really the opportunity to continue to work on at the Pentagon. Right. But we know the Saudis continue to be open to some kind of discussion on normalization. Of course, watch carefully MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia will be in Washington on November 18th, meeting with President Trump, an opportunity for them to describe, that vision of what it looks like for Saudi Arabia to take that step. President Trump may announce a security guarantee for Saudi Arabia in that meeting, just as he has already announced one for Qatar. These are done through executive order, so it's not the same as the full mutual defense treaty we were negotiating, which we wanted to be an accompanying agreement to a normalization deal. But I don't expect them to announce normalization, but maybe there's a way of signaling that, that path is still open. Other Arab partners have said fortunately, the Abraham Accord countries have remained, but other countries have indicated they're open to this, both within the region and outside. Indonesia, most prominently, seems to be very interested in getting on that path. But all this still has to be tested, right? And what happens in Gaza and how Arab publics are absorbing that news. It's not the same news as it was during the war, with pictures of casualties and hungry kids necessarily, but the lack of progress towards some better future could weigh heavily on people making real decisions. Obviously, what happens in the West Bank, where we've seen a kind of a spike in some violence by Israeli extremists there, could also weigh heavily. And I mentioned the Israeli political factors, and frankly, Netanyahu himself, right? He's a figure of significant controversy in the Arab world. And so it's plausible that MBS or any other Arab or Muslim leader would say, yeah, I'm still open to do this, but it sure would be easier to do it with a different Israeli leader, or it sure isn't something, a gift I want to give to Netanyahu during his election campaign. Why don't we wait till 2027 and see where we are?
I hope Arab leaders are listening to this podcast. I think they are, but I hope they definitely take on board that message, Dan, because in the past we've also seen, I think, the Arabs misread Israeli domestic politics, and then they're surprised with the outcome, even though that outcome was heavily influenced by certain decisions that they took in the past. And also, leaving aside Netanyahu, do you want to actually make this deal with this specific Israeli government?
Right. It's not just Netanyahu, right? There's Ben Gvir and Smotrich are part of that government too. So I think that's difficult. Now, of course, I don't rule out that Trump has more transactional goodies in his pockets. That he did. That was part of how the Abraham Accords came about. F-35s for the UAE, which they never ultimately got, but was sort of promised. Western Sahara from Morocco. Bahrain didn't really get much, but I mean, this is his style, and he's proven that it has some value. And so maybe Arab states who otherwise would be reluctant to move before there's a better path in Gaza or during the Israeli election might find there's some other motivation that says, yeah, I'll at least signal or at least take a partial step, maybe some exchanges with the Indonesians without full normalization and opening of embassies. I mean, you can imagine partial steps along the way, even during this period. And I'm for all of it, right? I think we want to get on that path. So I still think those opportunities are there, but I also approach it with a certain degree of caution because of the challenges that I laid out.
Right. Very important to be clear-eyed that this may not be happening tomorrow, despite what is sold in various quarters, both here and in other places. Dan, last question for you before we finish up, and it's a big one. Iran. To your credit, before Netanyahu decided to launch airstrikes and missiles at Iran this past June, you actually did take the threat of Israeli and U.S. military action seriously, and you said so during our last conversation. And you took it a lot more seriously, let's say, than many of us, and I include myself in that group. So now, on the other side of the 12-day war, with this perhaps new reality vis-a-vis Iran and its capabilities, two-part question for you. First, how successful do you actually think the 12-day war was in degrading Iran's capabilities, especially the nuclear program? And then second part of the question, stemming from that, what do you expect will happen in the coming weeks and months on this front, either in terms of diplomacy, either in terms of potentially further military action, or either in terms of just nothing? So you were right in your previous prediction. So what do you think will happen moving forward?
People should always be cautious about considering their abilities to predict to have improved just because they got one right. But look,
No, but people often forget the correct prognostications that people made, and then kind of say, "Oh, well, that it was inevitable that would happen."
Yeah.
When really
Well,
it
thank you.
wasn't.
I do think that it was inevitable and necessary to conduct military action against Iran's nuclear program. And I thought it might take place later in the year, maybe after the snapback sanctions that occurred around this time, frankly. So I was a little surprised by the timing, as I probably indicated on the previous podcast, but not by the need or by the ultimate decision. And I supported it. And I know very well the plan that President Trump ordered the U.S. military to carry out at the end of that 12 days. And it was, dramatically facilitated by what Israel had accomplished in the first 11 days, obviously against the leaders, against various key sites, but especially against the air defenses of Iran. And there's no question that campaign by the two militaries overall dealt a very significant blow to Iran's nuclear program. There is no prospect of them using those facilities that we struck and that Israel struck anytime soon to do enrichment or to do conversion or to do some of the research that was underway. Now that's those facilities. So very meaningful, probably buys, it's hard to know the exact amount of time, right? Usually when we say, well, it set them back a year or 2 years, that assumes that the day after the bombing, they would immediately begin digging out and reconstructing what was destroyed. That's not realistic. And there are lots of ways you can add to that time through, sanctions, through economic pressures, through political to dialogue, through, maybe additional strikes if necessary. So I think there's a significant amount of time put on the clock when Iran is not going to be able to be as close to a nuclear weapon as they were. And they were much too close for comfort, both on the enrichment side and on the weaponization side. So that's to the good. But of course, this story is not over, right? They still have some capability and some materials. They still have the highly enriched uranium, whether they have access to it or whether it's buried, we're not totally sure. We don't have inspectors in Iran right now to check that. There may always be facilities that we don't know about, and that's certainly a risk that they, set up some undeclared site and retrieve that enriched material and then do enrichment to 90% somewhere we we don't know about. Certainly that risk exists. And then, of course, there's the fact that even though they're weakened, badly weakened, and not just Iran, but the total access, you have to say they're down but not out. And we've got to be vigilant that they, at least at the level of the supreme leader and the immediate circle, are still committed to the same ideology that's got them to this point. That they have, that has driven them to make just enormous sacrifices, really squandering of massive resources, probably approaching $1 trillion worth over decades, to build that nuclear infrastructure, to arm those proxies, all for the purpose of an ideological commitment to destroy Israel and to drive the United States out of the Middle East and dominate the Middle East. So there's probably a debate. In fact, people who know internal Iranian politics much better than I do are describing a very significant debate that's happening internally in the sort of closing chapter of the supreme leader's life and leadership. We don't know how much longer he'll be in that role, of course. But should they double and triple down despite the blows they've taken and commit to the same agenda and maybe even try to do it covertly on the nuclear side and try to sprint to a nuclear weapon in a way that, sort of following a North Korea model? Or should they say, gosh, look what this has wrought for our country. The country is in such dramatic economic distress, water distress, power distress, societal distress. Maybe we should think about a different path and a different approach. And maybe we could get some of the sanctions, the new sanctions reimposed under the snapback lifted. Maybe we could get into some dialogue. I think that debate is probably happening inside Iran, but it's not settled yet. What do we need? We need to try to continue to obviously enforce all those sanctions, the old and the renewed. We need to try to get the inspectors back in so we have some answers to those sort of technical questions about where the material is and if it's being used in any way. We need to try to get a negotiation underway if they are willing, but driving toward a much harder bargain than Iran had ever agreed to. I think where the Trump was on the right, Trump administration on the right track in the earlier negotiations, zero enrichment, really an end to that capability at any time to produce nuclear weapons. And of course, we have to hold out the possibility that either Israel or the United States might need to take additional strikes. That's a real has to be a tool on the table if it's needed. The last thing I'd just say on this is that I mentioned the sort of transition Iran is heading toward. It is heading toward a leadership transition at some point. The supreme leader can't live forever, and I don't support or propose regime change as a policy to be executed by the United States and certainly not Israel, from as an external factor. But regime change is certainly possible, and transition is certainly going to happen. But regime change is possible if the Iranian people take matters into their own hands and decide that they want a better life, and this is not the kind of leadership that can deliver it. And I do think we should already now be doing the planning to prepare for how the United States and a bunch of other partners in and out of the region would help support that transition and try to steer it to the safest possible outcome, because there are a lot of different ways it could go. But we can even today be doing the things we probably are doing some, and I think should do more to support the Iranian people in appropriate ways, their ability to communicate over the internet, obviously calling out the abuses of Iranian leaders and officials against their people. That can and should be being done now. But you can prepare a plan, again, with some of those post-conflict or transition governance experts that we might have already dismissed from the U.S. government. But that expertise exists to support a transition, think about how to help a transition government in Iran structure its institutions, reform its institutions and structure them, what kind of assistance would be needed, how to try to help ensure that regional governments are able to reassure a transitional government in Iran that they would have support and could avoid conflict if they would take a certain set of steps and a certain path. So I think that preparation should be happening internally in the U.S. government and between the U.S. and allies now. Very hard to do because you don't really know when you're planning for. You don't really know what that transition is going to look like. As I said, it could go in multiple directions, some even more dangerous than the current and some far, far better, and could involve a lot of internal combustion within Iran. But, regime change planning or how to support that change when the Iranian people make that decision so that we hopefully help steer it to one of the better paths it could go on is a project we should be engaged in now.
Absolutely. And just like planning for post-war Gaza, it should have been done yesterday, before the day after, and not 2 days after the day after, like we are in right now. I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, my big takeaway from what you just said in terms of what the coming months and maybe years will bring is that it really depends on what happens inside Iran, less than decisions necessarily taken in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Washington. It's kind of developments on the ground inside Iran that will dictate where we go.
It will, and there's been some good writing on this, particularly Karim Sajidpour has a terrific piece in Foreign Affairs on different pathways that an Iranian transition could go, and it's a huge challenge, most of all for the Iranian people, to try to get their country on a path of a better future internally and with its neighbors, and it could go a lot of different directions.
Yep. Dan, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming back on and laying everything out for us. And I'm not even going to say it, but yes, this episode will have a longer shelf life than the last one when a 12-day war broke out. So we will see you hopefully sooner rather than later to discuss how all the things you laid out in terms of Gaza and the first stage and the second stage, actually transpires on the ground. So thank you again.
Thanks, Neri. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks again to Dan Shapiro for his generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producers, Jacob Gilman and Eden Jesselson, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so keeping a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast, of course. And most importantly, thank you for listening.